It was so quiet now. The world had been ending for hours, sounds of weapons fire, sounds of some alien language being shouted. Her broodnest was a small steel box with no windows, and she dared not open the door. Around her back legs, her younglings cowered. Her mate lay on his sleeping mat, unable to rise. Bandages covered his legs, his short quill-like feathers stripped bare, showing scars along his form from beatings that had taken place over the course of his life. They had never beaten her like that. The overseers didn't do that, not in a long time. To the overseers, it wasn't enough to simply hurt you. It simply wasn't their way. Long ago, they had realized how females of her species were supposed to defend their mate and their brood, how it was more than just an instinctual need. To her people, the female protective instinct was more than just a matter of survival. It was a deep and intense matter of integrity. When the overseers found this out, they took particular delight in it. Originally, when they wanted to prove a point, or when they wanted to just alleviate what seemed to be sheer boredom, they would come in and attack the females. Many elder matriarchs bore those scars with pride, but there was also the shame. When the overseers finally figured out why the females would stand up and take the beatings, everything changed. That was why her mate was barely able to move, covered in bandages, his small beak slightly open and his body twitching every so often. A group of overseers, for reasons she didn't know if there was even a reason at all, had come into their home 5 days ago. She had been shocked into near unconsciousness, and her entire family had been dragged into the street. There, in front of any who would watch, they pinned her to the ground and made her watch them savagely beat her mate. The overseers had struck his legs repeatedly until they had given out, and then set on him with the thick rods that she and her people simply called the rods. It was a cruel thing, the rods. They were built to bludgeon but not break, lacerate but not gash. They were meant to hurt but not kill. She was glad that her younglings were not home, still out in the field and working. They would have gladly expanded it to her young. Her neck still felt the weight of the overseer's leg pressed down on it even now. They had been coming more and more into the slave quarter recently, especially for the humans. The Chua were lucky enough to be small enough to simply hide away. She had seen the humans dragged into the street so many times in the last week it had actually begun to alarm her. What was worse was what they had done to them. What had happened to her and her mate, she knew, was mostly for entertainment. What they had done to the humans, it appeared very personal. She admired the humans, even though she had never spoken to one. But what she knew of them, they were hard workers and very driven. To be caught trying to communicate with another species merited a death that was so horrifying the first time she had seen it. She had never once thought to even look at a human or Chua besides brief glances or observing from a distance. The last week, the overseers had been dragging the humans into the street almost hourly. The beatings that she had seen issued to her had come with the mocking laughter of the overseers. The beatings given to the humans, screeching, shrieking, or just silence. They would see one of the bipedal mammals, descend on them like locusts, and leave them broken and bleeding on the ground. Then this morning it had started. The sounds of weapons she had never heard in the streets, the distant bloom of explosions, things falling like meteors from the sky. She had pulled her brood back into her broodnest, and she didn't dare step outside again. She didn't even know what time of the day it was. "Eudora." She heard a weak rasp behind her, and she ushered her younglings closer to her mate. "Quolovar," she warbled back and watched as he gestured with his beak to the door. Without a word, she pushed her brood behind her body and put herself between her younglings, her mate, and the door itself. Males of her species had much better hearing, the better to care for the quiet younglings, but she possessed the physical might. She went down to all fours, her thick neck lowered with her beak close to the ground, her haunches raised. Her feathers were raised in a threat display. A few seconds later, she heard the soft impacts of footfalls, human by the sound of them. Her feathers relaxed a bit but remained slightly raised. Why was a human coming here? When the door opened, the first thing she noticed was the rifle, and the height of the figure in the doorway. The rifle pointed at her fell only a moment after the door had been opened. The body armor it wore was black and bore several scars along its arms and torso. The helmet was clean, but just underneath the helmet it was sprayed with ichor, Ydora knew very well belonged to the overseers. He raised his hand to her, palm held up, and she heard what could only be human speech, a low rolling sound with staccato clips. She understood none of it. She completely lowered her feathers and suddenly felt a pang inside her chest, something she had only felt when one of her younglings had turned the corner on a fever years ago. The human began speaking again, but again nothing made sense. She suddenly heard more footfalls, this time sounding more fleshy. A small brown chua in loose rags padded around the human's leg and chirped at the armored figure, and the human spoke again. The chua responded with a series of chirps, then looked from the human to Eudora. He padded closer on his small webbed feet, holding a small device in his hands. She kept her eyes on the human for a few more moments, then looked to the small chua once more, eye level with him as she was hunched so low to the ground. The chua held up the smooth cylinder, then turned his head and pointed directly behind his ear cavity. She could see a small drop of green blood where something had been injected. She glanced back to the human who was leaning his rifle against the wall of her broodnest. As she looked to the chua once more, the chua simply pointed back to the human. She heard a hiss and her eyes darted back to the human, and she could see the release of gas around the human's helmet. As he pulled it off, she noticed his hair was cut close to his scalp, a strange thing the humans did. He had hard eyes, a predator's eyes, but she could tell just by the way he was looking at her that while he may be a hunter and a killer, she was not his prey. He turned his head, leaning forward slowly and pulling forward on a fleshy bit near what she could only guess was his own ear canal. A small scar was present at about the same distance as the fresh mark of the chua's. Eudora almost wanted to cry out. She thought she knew what this meant. She hoped she was right. She looked to the chua and turned her head away from him. He padded close and held the cylinder device against her head, gently brushing the soft down around her head until she reached up and drew the downy feathers from her ear canal. He moved it slowly over, then looked to the human, who spoke a short bark. She felt a sudden sting but didn't move, setting a proper example for her brood. She blinked a few times, then looked to the chua, who then looked to the human. The hard eyes seemed to swallow her, and she suddenly realized he was curious. He opened his mouth, his smooth vocalizations coming for. "Can you understand me?" His vocalizations came into her ear with his tone, but the warbles of her people filled her ears. "If you can understand me, blink your eyes twice." Eudora blinked her eyes twice at the human, marveling at this. His mouth didn't move like her beak, but she understood him all the same. She raised off of her haunches and slowly raised to stand on two legs once again. "Are you hurt?" the human asked, motioning to her mate, who the chua was already kneeling over. She saw her mate's eyes pinch shut once, then open once more. Eudora looked between the human and her mate. "Yes," she said, drawing out the word. She watched the human's expression as he began speaking again, leaning towards a small receiver that was bonded to his armor just below his mouth. He picked up his helmet and placed the open end near his head. "Control, this is 7. I have encountered a HFY family group. Mark my location. Medical check required." She canted her head to the side as she heard a short acknowledgement come through the helmet. "What is your name?" "I am Sergeant Hakuri Watanabe of the Terran Front." She listened to his name, then slowly, she lifted her clawed forelimbs to open them, palms facing away, claws facing away, in what she knew to be a symbol of non-aggression. "I'm Eudora, Kidishi, matriarch." Her grand matriarch had told her once how her people had once introduced themselves by name, by clade, and by standing, and to stand like this when welcoming an outsider. She had only done it twice before, once to an overseer who had beaten her for it, and once to Quolovar. Each time her standing had been different. She saw the eyebrows of the human raise slightly, his eyes glancing to the chua, who nodded once at him. "Control. Match confirmed," the human sergeant said softly into the transmitter, leaning his head forward. "Please advise." Eudora blinked once, then felt her feathers along her back begin to rise slowly. The human raised his helmet to his ear again and listened intently as a voice came through his helmet. Whoever was talking was speaking fast, but too low for her to hear. She heard Quillivar's breath hitch in his chest, and she looked down at him. His flank quills were twitching happily, his eyes fixated on her. Pure joy, but she didn't know why. For not the first time she wished she had his hearing. "What did they say, Quillivar? Could you understand them?" she asked. She looked between her mate and the human. "Let him say it," Quillivar said, and his clawed forelimb lightly tapped her leg. "You'll want to hear this from him." She turned her gaze from her mate and settled back on the human. Hakuri did not move, looking at her as he gave short acknowledgments in between a series of instructions too low for her to hear. After one more acknowledgement, he reached down and opened a hidden panel on his left forearm. She couldn't tell what he did, but a moment later she knew. "Sergeant, we are hearing you on Antares." She heard a woman's voice, stern yet passionate, through the helmet's speakers. This time there was no problem understanding the words. "Understood, Fleet Marshal," Hakuri said, never taking his eyes off of Eudora as he stepped closer. Her forelimbs came down to her sides, and she was surprised as he stopped about 2 paces away and slowly knelt in front of her. "Eudora Kadishi Matriarch," he said, and she was so taken aback that she didn't bother correcting him. "You are the first of the Kadishi line to be liberated from the Vral." She blinked at him, wondering what a Vral even was and what her clade was being brought up for. "I am?" she asked. Then she looked back to her mate, who motioned with his head back to the human. "Your clade name, Kadishi, was invented. Your true clan name was Calandro, which was the ruling clade of the SciFi," the human said, and she blinked. "It is my duty to inform you that in accordance with the last government of the SciFi, and with respect to that same, you are the current de facto head of state of the SciFi accordance." Eudora blinked again, then looked down at her mate. "What?" Eudora said, and her mate clicked his beak together, a sign of approval. Eudora looked back to the human, who was kneeling in front of her still. "What are you even talking about?" She didn't know what to expect during the assault. The world is cruel to those who have no power, and she had none at all. They could have been dragged off to labor under harsher chains. They could have been killed outright. Liberated? That she hadn't even really begun to process, and now this? The clade Calandro was extinct. The overseers had wiped them out ages ago. The human kneeling in front of her just looked up at her, saying nothing. The helmet was silent. "What are you talking about?" she asked again. "You are, as of today, until such time as you and your people see fit, the de facto leader of the SciFi," Hakuri said, and then motioned to her. "We are asking you to take up leadership until either a senior member of your clade is found or a new form of government is decided on." Eudora's head was swimming, and she took a step back from the human. "No," she said, remembering how the overseers had treated her, what they had done, the humiliation and the shame. Now she was being told this. Were the humans any different? "I'm no figurehead, and I won't be your collaborator. I won't do this." Eudora felt a squeeze on her ankle and looked down to her mate, who once more clicked his beak. She wasn't swayed as she looked back to the human, glancing at the rifle leaning against the doorway. "The overseers are dead." The human cut her off. "And they were called the Vral. Your people have spent 5 of your generations as slaves to them." Eudora looked from the rifle to the human once more. "There are more of them out there, and more of your people. We are not asking you to be a figurehead or a collaborator." He glanced towards his helmet, seeming as if he wished someone else was doing this. He looked back at her. "We are asking if you will speak for your people until your people decide what they wish to do." "What we wish to do?" Eudora asked. "Yes," the human said. "What does that even mean?" She whispered, and for a second she felt the enormity of that word, freedom, what it meant. She had worked at the overseer's demands her entire life, under constant watch, under constant lash. The concept of that not being the case was completely foreign. The human was silent. "It means you have work to do." The woman's voice came from the helmet. "Your people will be brought to you. You must speak to them. They must speak through you for now. Until you either appoint a new leader or decide to continue, we need you." "Can she hear me?" Eudora asked, and the human nodded. "Who are you?" she asked, speaking a bit louder. "Fleet Marshal Simmons, Terran Front Navy. You are Eudora Calandro Matriarch Primus," the voice said, and Eudora's eyes widened, hearing a title that she had only heard old ones speak about. I know this is sudden, but I need you to accept this. Have you ever thought about what would happen if your people were freed? The woman's voice came through the helmet clearly, and even though she paused, Eudora knew she wasn't done speaking. Well, so far every SciFi we've spoken to has asked if a calendro had been found. The human kneeling in front of her was silent. Eudora was silent because she knew that Simmons was right. The first thing she would have asked, if she had had the time to really ask, was if a member of the calendro clade had been found. I will not be a collaborator if that's what you are wanting. Far from it. The woman's voice came from the helmet speakers. The last thing we want to do is subsume your people against their wishes. For now, we need to get your people organized and established, and that's going to take work. It's going to take a lot of work. If you tell me no, then I'll order the sergeant to keep quiet about who you are, and that will be that. We'll figure something out in the meantime, but at the end of the day, it's going to be up to your people what they want to do. We're just asking you to be a part of that in the way your own people want. The voice went quiet. The Chua standing nearby was silent. Everyone was silent. Eudora looked down at the helmet. Her mind was a torrent of thoughts, but after a few moments she felt her mate's hand on her ankle. She looked down at him. I told you you were a queen, he said and tittered weakly in amusement. She rolled her feathers and sighed. You can do it, he said, and he took his hand off her ankle. I can, she said, then she looked back at the human kneeling in front of her. I will. I look forward to meeting you in person. The voice that called herself Simmons said from the inside of the helmet. In the vacuum of space, Simmons smiled to herself. Then she looked at Petty Officer Hazard. 7, you are to remain at her side until the medical teams arrive. As soon as they are able, call for a shuttle. I need to meet with her and go over the details. She waited until the acknowledgement came. Then she took the headset off and offered it back to Hazard. She glanced out of the long front view screen for a few moments. Tired, ma'am? She looked back at Hazard. If I pass out, crewman, just hit me with some stims and kick me a few times. Hazard grinned at her as she turned and made her way back to her display on the central table. She was glad to have found the Kelendro descendant. It was going to be useful to have a figurehead to build the SciFi around. She only hoped it would go right. The last damned thing she wanted or anyone else wanted was a dependent people who couldn't find their footing. The Chua had maintained their identity, and she knew that now that their space was taken, a lot of the Chua living in human space would be going home. How does one maintain their identity, though, when no one alive when it was stripped from them is around that they are being asked to show it again? She didn't know the answer to that question. Her eyes looked at a question that she also didn't know the answer to. Her eyes ran down the report again from the recon team. The Vral, before her fleet had come into the system, had laid waste to a solid 20 kilometers of the surface, and only that. The initial findings showed that the Vral had done it with precision laser batteries, which struck her as odd considering they could have dropped a few graviton bombs instead. It had intrigued more than just her. Whatever the Vral had been up to, they didn't want it to be seen. Bombs left debris. They had melted the entire area to slag. Inside that 20 kilometers and just that 20 kilometers, the Vral had dedicated enough laser battery firepower to turn not just the buildings to atoms, but they had liquefied the crust to the point it had sunk down nearly 1/10 of a kilometer. So far, they had not found any non-hardened electronics within 1,000 kilometers of the site itself. The bloom of EM radiation the probe had picked up was gone. The site that had been the epicenter of the bloom was a crater of molten rock. Whatever had been happening in that small 20 kilometers, it was something that neither she nor anyone at the Terran front knew anything about. Nothing they had captured had any data pointing to the site. No one that had been liberated knew of its existence. When teams had landed in the surrounding towns, they had found them completely abandoned. Anyone who knew what had existed at that site was out of the system before she had destroyed the fleet, or had been on the surface and took their secrets to the grave. In fact, what she was looking at was a staggering nothing. No words, no one talking, no writing, no files, nothing. An EM field the size of Australia, a monstrously powerful one at that, had simply vanished alongside anything that could be linked to a cause for it. "What were you doing down there?" she whispered. No one replied.